So if you're in my Art 121 class, this is the last lecture of the semester. If you're in my Art 122 class, this is the first lecture of the semester after the introduction lecture. So this one's pretty long, and I'm going to give you a good spot that you should pause and take a break and do something else for a while, and then come back to it later, because this really should be a couple of lectures. But we're covering painting, which we haven't talked about if you're in the Art 121 class so much. So we have a lot of catching up to do to kind of understand what's going on in the wonderful picture that we're looking at right here. So the painting that we're going to talk about is Italian painting, and it's useful for understanding, if you're in my Art 122, what's going to happen in the Renaissance. And for those of you in Art 121, it'll be useful to kind of like wrap it up and help you understand how we got to what happens later. So Italy from about 1200 to 1400, we see a revival of classical art, just like we had seen in France. And the Gothic name attached to French art was derogatory. And this is what, in the Renaissance, people referred to the Gothic art as distortions of the noble art of the Greeks and Romans. And they considered themselves, the Italians, to be the true revival. And sometimes when people think of the Renaissance, they think of it starting with one of the artists that we'll look at today, whose name is Giotto, but not everyone. So according to Kleiner, it was much more pervasive and long-lasting. So that makes sense. I think that's a factual statement and not just an opinion. We saw in France how the classical style kind of gave way to the elegant style, which was more similar to what we saw in, say, the Romanesque in earlier periods than what we're going to see in Italy. So, and Italy eventually is going to be kind of the start of the Renaissance later on. So I think that's a factual statement that Kleiner is making. So there's a bunch of political reasons why you would see this sort of thing happen in Italy. We've already seen there's like cultural reasons back to ancient Rome, where a lot of these arts were made. But as far as the political situation that this grew up in, we can start with Frederick II, who is the king of Sicily. Hard to believe, 53 years, that's a long time. And then the Holy Roman Emperor from 1220 to 1250. So Sicily is a huge island, the home of some of my ancestors, just south of the Italian peninsula. Today, it's part of the country of Italy, but at that time, it was just an island. And the Holy Roman Emperor, that means something a little bigger than being the king of Sicily, which is a big island. But the Holy Roman Emperor is someone that looks at themselves as going back all the way to Justinian, the first kind of Christian emperor. And it occupies a lot of areas of Italy and what is today Germany and Austria. So Frederick's nostalgia for the past grandeur of Rome fostered a revival of Roman sculpture in Sicily and southern Italy. So we've already seen it before. People with power, they love to associate themselves with ancient Rome, or with Jesus, or with both. And that's generally what we see now. For obvious reasons, powerful people want to be associated with powerful polities. So if you look at Italy, remember the country of Italy didn't exist at this time. So we have these city-states, some of which are kingdoms. So the kingdoms of Naples, Sicily. We've already looked at the Duchy of Milan, of Savoy. That's just a different type of monarchy, but there's republics as well, like the Republic of Florence and the Republic of Pisa, which we had looked at previously. The papal states are really interesting because there actually is a papal state still today where Pope Francis is technically the political leader, but it's just a tiny area inside of Rome called Vatican City. But at this time, the Pope had real political power, not just in this area that he has direct control over, but also because he's the head of the church. He has a lot of influence over everybody that we looked at so far, everybody that's part of the Catholic Church. So if you think of Pope Francis, the modern leader, he's more of a kind of a spiritual leader or even like a philosophical leader. At this time, popes were real political leaders with real armies. So probably couldn't imagine Francis doing that sort of thing. So how we can start to understand some of the things that are going on is they're very similar to what we saw in France. We have a classical style and we have this elegant style. And just like France, the classical style was something that we saw that was earlier. And then when we had that whole hubbub about two different popes and one in France, in Italy, we saw a lot of artists who were making this elegant style. But eventually, you know, the classical style will come back, and that's what will lead to the Renaissance. So what you can do now if you want is pause the video and kind of write something in your extra credit board, comparing and contrasting. And when you're ready, just start it up again. So you can pause now. And I'll kind of talk about what's going on with these two pictures. What most classes notice is that it's the same scene. So it's the Nativity, the Annunciation, Nativity, and Adoration of the Shepherds. And that is in each of these. And I'll kind of talk about that in more detail in a moment. But what most people notice is that on the left, we see figures that are more like Greek and Roman figures. We see the feminine figure of Mary, who appears twice here, and then another time, but smaller. And she's kind of shown with that heavy mantle, so like kind of like a strong jaw, a very straight nose, and a perfect roundness above the brow, and then this kind of like small poofy lips, very much like what we would see in ancient Greece or Rome. And when we look at the cloaks, they are making these kind of impossible folds and clinging to the body, just like we had seen again in ancient Greece and Rome. And if you remember the high classical sculpture, what we call the high classical sculpture in ancient Greece, it had the figures always had a very pensive expression. They didn't show too much emotion. And most people see that here. Mary is supposed to have just given birth in this one, but she looks like she's no worse for the wear. We can see the little baby Jesus over there is pretty calm as well. And the figures are more bulky, so they have this like three-dimensional effect. The ones up here are definitely three-dimensional, but these ones are thicker. And that's what people tended to do when they did the classical style and the Gothic, you know, kind of almost overemphasize the thickness of the figures. And then the right, and everything's pretty packed, and there's lots of straight and perpendicular lines, not a lot of curves. If you just unfocus your eyes, everything will seem kind of like organized if you're not seeing the details, a lot of organized lines. And the last thing you can see is that we have this Roman style architecture in the background with a cornice above it. And we can see it's almost like a pediment, like a Greek temple as well. On the right, if you start by unfocusing your eyes, you'll notice that there's lots of curved lines everywhere. So that automatically in Western art kind of tends you to say that there's more emotion, there's more dynamics. We have more ups and downs. So we're not going for that kind of perfect Zen center that you would see in the high classical Greek art or this classical style that we see over here. You also notice the figures are thinner. They're not quite that weird kind of long-necked and long-fingered look like we saw in the elegant style, but there is some qualities that are similar to it in that we have this extreme contrapposto where it always looks like there's a strong wind blowing. And there's also a lot more interaction between the figures. We see a little bit here, but we see more dynamic views. We see Mary looking at the baby as you would expect someone who had just given birth. I don't know if any of you have ever been around after a woman has just given birth, but they want to look at the baby. It's this baby has been growing inside of them for so long. There's nothing that they want to do more than stare at this beautiful creation of theirs. So that's what we see here. So it's a little bit more It can be kind of weird with the way the figures are posed, but there's more emotion, and that comes from the lines and from the way the figures are interacting with each other. So the classical style is kind of first, but it's going to come back and really dominate, especially if you're in my Art 122 class, so we'll talk about Renaissance. And the early one is made by Nicola Pisano, and it's made for the baptistry in Pisa, and it's a pulpit. A pulpit is just somewhere where a priest would preach from, and they would use this specifically for the one part of the mass, and that's what they call the like kind of religious celebration that Catholics have every week. It's called the Mass. This would be the one part where they would speak in the language that people could understand. So the rest of the church service, the Mass, would be in Latin. And then they would go up to this and they would speak to the person in their own language. In this case, it would be, medieval Italian. So with this one, we do see some Gothic elements. There's a tri-lobed or trefoil arches right here. Not something you would generally see in ancient Rome. And then there's a lion supporting the columns. They also use the Corinthian columns, which do come from ancient Greece and Rome. But in the Gothic, they tend to use the Corinthian columns more because they're the fanciest. They have the most decoration and the most details. But there are classical or Romanesque type qualities. So despite the trilobing, this is rounded. The way that the panels are made is very much like a Roman sarcophagus. If you get a chance to go to DIA, you can see an example of that where they would have panels like this. And it's carved out of marble, so that kind of tells you it's a Romanesque type of thing. When you get in close, there is the classical things that we had talked about when we were comparing the two pieces, but there's also some Gothic elements. And one of the Gothic elements is they tend to have different parts of the story in the same frame. So it says Annunciation, Nativity, and Adoration of the Shepherds. So Annunciation is over here. This is Mary, and she's supposed to be like a young teenager in this one, like 14 years old or something like that. She looks a little older. And then we have the angel Gabriel. And Gabriel is telling her that despite her never having had sex, she's pregnant. And she's going to be pregnant with Emmanuel, which means the light. And means Jesus. So as you might imagine, since she's never had sex, she's kind of taken aback. So she does this pose where she kind of grabs her chest as if she's really surprised, because who wouldn't be in this particular situation? But again, with the facial expression, we don't see much at all. Then another part of the story is the nativity. In the Bible story, it's not told in all of the Gospels, but in some of them. Most of the story comes from the Gospel of Luke. And in it, Mary and Joseph is pictured here. They're just regular people. Joseph's like a carpenter. They don't have a lot of money. They're traveling because the Roman emperor at that time made everybody travel back to their hometown to be able to do a census. And on their way back, they couldn't find anywhere to stay. So they tried to find a hotel. There wasn't any rooms left. So they ended up putting them up in a stable with all the farm animals. So we see some of them there. And Jesus is born, and they wrap him up because that's what you do with babies. I love that. So we see that part of the scene there. Meanwhile, there's a bunch of parts of the story to show that Jesus is pretty special. One of those is that there's a star in the sky, and it's a star that nobody had noticed before. It's very bright. And shepherds, they see this star and they're drawn towards the stable, and they come in and they visit Jesus. Same thing with the three kings that we had looked at way back in the day with Theodora. They were drawn by the star to visit Jesus. So the last part of the story we see is something that is what most people do, but it's a very particular ritual in Judaism where they kind of wash the baby. Unfortunately, Jesus' baby lost his head and Mary lost her arm. But again, we see these pensive expressions. But what's interesting is Joseph does have an expression. And I think most people would describe that as uh, I wish I could make the expression myself. That's the easiest way to do it. I don't have the video on. But skeptical is the look. Um, and it would kind of make sense. What happened is in the Bible story, Mary and Joseph were betrothed. And in ancient Palestine, Jewish people would get betrothed, and it was the same as getting married, but not quite. This would be a time for a couple to get together and basically decide if they work. So you would be expected usually to have sex. If that didn't work, then you would try to find somebody else. But Joseph and Mary had never done that. So when Joseph found out that Mary was pregnant, he thought, okay, she must have found somebody else. So I'll just like, you know, divorce her quietly, and then she can go be with this other dude. Um, but then he had a dream, and the dream told him exactly what the angel Gabriel told Mary, that it was this miraculous conception, and it was going to be Jesus. But it was in a dream. So he woke up. Maybe he believed it, maybe he didn't. I think what we see here with his facial expression, that it's kind of like what we saw with Hercules and Amphitryon, his earthly father. It's like, I wonder, he could be scratching his beard in this one. And you might think, oh, wow, does that mean that Christians don't think this Joseph guy is a very good guy? No, no, not exactly. In the Catholic Church, and this is true to this day, I grew up Catholic and went to Catholic school. There's this idea that faith in miracles is irrational. It's something that is not easy to do. So the idea is that there'll be challenges of faith for things that are hard to believe, and people have to realistically deal with that. So we might be seeing Joseph having this challenge of faith when he actually sees the baby, and kind of realizing, I don't know if I believe what I thought I believed. So this is a pretty common struggle that the Catholic Church and kind of recognizes. So we have similar styles throughout, these kind of like big bulky figures with these heavy mantles, but like the Gothic, their faces are basically all the same. We don't have a lot of difference. You may recognize this face is pretty much exactly the same as the ones we saw in Chart with the Death of Mary. So they're not trying to do individual faces yet, and that's very Gothic. So these three kings, they're all giving Jesus some gifts, and Jesus, quite a bouncing looking baby at this moment, certainly very healthy, is taking them in this kind of adult type way. And that's a kind of an interpretation of the way that people look at the Bible, that Jesus, he wasn't just a normal baby. He was kind of special because remember, Christians think that he's God made into a human. So similar to what we saw in the Strasbourg Cathedral in the Death of Mary, uh, but a little bit more of this French style going on here, but still, a lot of qualities that overlap. But you see more of the French style here with the lines, whereas the lines here are a little bit more organized. So Giovanni Pisano, who is Nicola's son, not a coincidence, these types of jobs are usually passed on to the family, and you're trained by people in your family. So it was kind of limited, the people that could do this sort of thing. And at this time, most of the people that did this weren't necessarily considered to be artists in the modern sense, and that they're making intellectual things. Instead, they were usually considered to be craftspeople. So passing it on would be the same as, like, in the gospel where Jesus was a carpenter because Joseph was a carpenter. So you can probably tell right away there's a lot more Gothic elements. We have lots more of these kind of like fiddly details, and there's a lot more going on. There's more curved lines, kind of more density of decoration, all things that we'd seen. And although there's a lot of circles here, it does make a pointed arch if you kind of like follow the lines, kind of average them out. We get in closer, we can see this French style has taken hold in Italy at this time. And just like the other one, We have the Gothic way of telling a story, but it's a lot more dramatic. We have the Annunciation over here. That's the angel Gabriel. Mary's here, and she's missing her head, but she's still being told the same thing, and she's kind of grabbing her cloak and held aback. She's really surprised about being pregnant. Then we see the birth here, and most students notice that there's a lot more emotion going on. We see Mary looking at the baby like you would expect someone who has fallen in love with the most beautiful thing they've ever seen before. And that's what we're seeing, this very kind of intense gaze and her mouth open a little bit as if she's like just kind of stunned. We see the shepherds as well, and you can really see that extreme contrapposto in here where, like I said, it looks like a wind is blowing, and kind of scattered elements. A lot of people notice that there's deeper recesses, so more shadows, and it seems to give you more space. And in a way that can make things more dynamic because we see things in the background. It seems like there's things in the foreground. And then here we see almost an exact copy of Amphitryon. We were looking at Hercules. He's doing the scratching the beard thing. He's really wondering about what just happened. And then we have the baby Jesus here, unfortunately looking like that doll from Chucky. I think that's partly the lighting that we're getting here. Probably not the best thing. So this is more like the elegant style that we had looked at in France. So the version of Paris over here, a similar style going on here. Facial expressions are different, a little bit more naturalistic here, and that weird kind of elegant style face. It looks a little bit like an alien here, but similarities all the way around other than that. So this one is very interesting because we're really on the precipice of the Renaissance, and the artist Lorenzo Ghiberti would become a full-on Renaissance artist. And we can see some of the hints of what he would become in this one in 1402. This was a contest panel. So the wool merchants in Florence, they were funding these bronze plaques for some of the baptistry doors in the East doors in Florence. And that's pretty common. People that were in trade groups, what we call unions sometimes nowadays, they would fund these sorts of things. It was their way of kind of like giving to the church and perhaps getting a little favor. So this wool merchants competition, everybody had to make the same scene and a bronze plaque, and Ghiberti's won. The Visconti from Milan was fighting the people in Florence, and he had Florence surrounded. And when military leaders do that, they're trying to do one of the most cruel things you can do in warfare, and that's a siege, to basically test the resolve of the people inside and hopefully like get them to give up. But the Florentines didn't give up, and the armies of Milan eventually disbanded. That's their point of view. Turned out the Visconti died, and then the army didn't really want to do to attack Florence anymore, so they just left. But from the point of view of the Florentines, they saw themselves as sacrificing for freedom and republic. So remember, republic is the same type of government that the United States has today, at least in theory. So there are some Gothic elements. This quatrefoil shape, something that's all over the Gothic. Even if I hadn't pointed it out, it was all over the churches. You can kind of go back and check them out. But there's a lot of classical things, meaning going back to ancient Greece and Rome. The first thing is the nude. And if it seems like we haven't seen a nude person for a long time, that's because we haven't. People hadn't made in the West, they had in other parts of the world, nude figures since ancient Rome. So this is the first one since ancient Rome. And then there's a certain amount of temperament. So we're going to get close in on Isaac and see that. And a bit of space that will really take hold in the Renaissance. So part of the reason why they chose this story is because they think of themselves as sacrificing for freedom and republic, sacrificing everything for ideas, basically. So they relate to the story of the sacrifice of Isaac. In the Old Testament, Abraham has a wife, Sarah. They're both very old, and Sarah never gets pregnant, and they're never able to have a child. And I told the story before, but just again, so we can understand the importance of it. And of course, Abraham had a side woman, Hagar, and they had a kid. But his first wife, Sarah, he didn't have any children with him. So in the story, God gifts Sarah and Abraham with a pregnancy. They're supposedly 80 years old at the time. So it's truly miraculous. And when they give birth, it's Isaac. So this is basically the most wonderful thing that ever happened to them, kind of like what we were looking at with Mary. And Abraham treasured his son Isaac. Everyone treasures their kids, but this is a miracle baby. So when he grows up to be a teenager, God wants to test Abraham, and he says, take Isaac to this stone and sacrifice him as you would a lamb. So we see the first part of the story where they're kind of like taking Isaac, and then we see the part where Abraham takes out that sword and is about to slit his own miracle baby's throat, the person he loves more than anyone in the world. And God sends an angel down, and you can see, to stop him from doing that. And the result of this is that God basically sees that Abraham passed this test, and he makes a covenant with Abraham and says, you are the father of the chosen people. Every man has to be circumcised, and it will be a symbol of this agreement, a covenant between God and man. So this ultimate kind of sacrifice for an idea is what the Florentines relate to. So when you get in close, look at that face with the furrowed brow, and kind of like you can see the line showing up. He's very firm. He's going to do it. And then Isaac, which is interesting, his father is about to execute him, but he doesn't seem particularly concerned. So we see that kind of like classical idea of this pensive face overriding the narrative. It may also be trying to show Isaac as heroic, and that might be why he chose the nude. Because remember, in ancient Greece, the male nude was heroic. So it kind of adds to some of those ideas. So this would be a good place to stop and then take a break and then come back later. I'll keep going, but you should take a break. So the Proto-Renaissance painting in Italy, and I say Proto-Renaissance because some of this stuff is going to lead towards what happens in the Renaissance. So first we'll look at something that's in a style that's very similar to what we looked at before, Byzantine style. And this is Duccio and Christ entering Jerusalem. And usually I ask students to kind of look at what's going on in this picture. They notice that the figures are grouped really strongly together. Everything's pretty flat. There's a gold background. There's some Gothic architecture in the background, so that's a pretty common thing. They put contemporary architecture in, even though we have these like kind of biblical clothes with the robes. They put contemporary architecture in. And the other thing people notice is that's very Gothic, is that if you think about where would you be standing to be able to see this picture? And if you think about it, you would be standing basically nowhere. You'd be floating in the air to be able to see a picture like this. We can see a lot of ground here. We're not continuous with the ground. If we look at this picture, we don't feel like we can walk onto this ground here or this ground here. Instead, we would almost have to like fall downwards into it. And that seems like, a small point, but it'll make a lot of sense when we get in closer. So the story that's here is something that's very important to Christians. And it shows, again, this idea of testing faith. So this is toward the last week of Jesus's life, before he's executed by being crucified. And he is a famous preacher at this point, all around the area that was called Galilee at that time in ancient Palestine. And his name precedes him. And some people heard about like miracles that he did and heard about some of the things he said. And him and his band of fellows, 12 of them right here. It's not really important to identify them, but there's a couple you can identify if you know your stuff. And we see Jesus in front. He's got the halo, so we know he's holy, pretty important. The rest of them have halos as well, except for one. And we'll talk about that guy a little bit later on in a different picture. And when he enters Jerusalem, his name precedes him, and everybody's excited about this new preacher coming into town. They called them rabbis back then. It just means teacher. And he rides in on a donkey or an ass. I'm not sure the difference between the animals, so it's one of those. And everybody is so excited. They get a bunch of palm fronds, and they throw up their hands and kind of wave the palm fronds. They put all of these cloaks before his donkey, and they're basically celebrating his arrival. The simple homeless guy, they're celebrating his arrival as if he's a king. And the reason why this is really important, because by Friday, so this is on a Sunday, by Friday of this same week, these same people will be calling for the execution of Jesus. So this again shows how faith is like kind of a difficult thing, and people can betray their faith sometimes. So this is a very important feast day in the Catholic Church. So it's before Easter. Easter is on the Sunday following this one. So people in the Catholic Church, they hand out palm fronds, and you do a thing where you kind of like celebrate the priest as if he was Jesus. Later in the week, Catholics go to church on Thursday or Friday, and then you do what's called a passion play. And this passion play is very important to Catholics because the idea for Christians is that Jesus is God made flesh, and he sacrifices that flesh for humanity. And part of that sacrifice is that, remember, the idea is that humans committed original sin, and all humans have that stain of it on them. So in the Catholic Church, they encourage people to take responsibility for humans, their sins, and for the death of Christ. So in this passion play, they have usually the main priest play Jesus, and they have the rest of us play the crowd. So I'll kind of talk about that story a little bit later on as we look at other pieces that'll fill in some of the details. So you can get in close, we can see a lot of Gothic things going on, very similar faces. There's not a lot of differentiation in the faces. And I keep mentioning that because we're going to see something a little bit different. Look at these like kind of elongated figures. There is like attempts at shading, but it's pretty flat compared to what we're going to see a little bit later on. So there's some Gothic elements, but also some things that we're going to see going into the other styles. And in the background, very Gothic elements. You can see by these lancet-shaped windows and those pointed spires. This is a Gothic building, certainly not something you would see in ancient Palestine. So the one we had just looked at is got some like classical type elements, but this one, the Maestà from Duccio, is very, very flat and very typical of what you would see. From the Byzantine, we have Mary in the middle, and she's got that wonderful, elegant alien face. And then Jesus right here, there's this attempt at three-dimensionality with the throne. Basically, everybody else is just flat, smacked up against the picture plane. It's less advanced, and what they mean by advanced is less three-dimensional, less Renaissance-like, more Gothic. So I don't think advanced is necessarily the best word, isn't better, just different time period. So there's a couple of things that I'm going to have another slide where I identify a bunch of these people. It's not super important. I just put it on there in case you wonder. But I will identify one person besides Mary and Jesus. And that's this guy right here. It's John the Baptist. And you'll notice that he's kind of like waving his hand. Sometimes in other pictures, he'll be pointing towards Jesus. And that's because John the Baptist was the cousin of Jesus. And when he grew up, he also became a preacher. Before Jesus started preaching, John the Baptist was really famous for baptizing people. It was basically people would come up to him and he would dip them in water and they would be kind of like renewed in their faith in God. At that time, nobody was Christian, everybody was Jewish, so they just meant God. And so Jesus takes a visit to his cousin and goes up to him and he says, I want to be baptized. And John the Baptist says, I'm not worthy, basically, because he recognizes him as something special. And because of that, John the Baptist is often thought to be the second Christian. Mary would be the first Christian because she's told by God that what Jesus is all about. And then John the Baptist is the first person in the rest of the world to recognize that he was something special. So you can always tell who he is because he gets martyred later on. He gets his head cut off. It's a pretty good story. And he's carrying that martyr staff, so long staff with a cross at the top. He's generally thought to be the first Christian martyr because he's killed before Jesus, and Jesus is the second Christian martyr. He's usually identified because he was what's called an ascetic, and that's a different word than aesthetic. An ascetic is someone who kind of denies themselves something to have an spiritual experience. So it's a very common thing in many religions. The most famous are usually like in the Hindu religion. Ascetics are so really well supported. So ascetics will usually do kind of strange things that deny their bodies so they can become kind of more spiritual. So what John did is he lived out in the desert and ate locusts. And because he was out in the desert, his skin was pretty dark. Everybody's skin in Palestine would be pretty dark at that time, but his was extra dark. And he didn't comb his hair, so you can see he's got like knotted hair everywhere, and he wore animal skins. So he's got this extra cloak going on, but the animal skins and the knotty hair and the darker skin than the rest of these figures, which should be darker if they're accurate to Palestine, especially Jesus and Mary, we see him, and that's how we know it's him. So if you're interested in the rest of them, you don't have to know this for the test. This is just in case you're wondering who these are. You can pause it and you can look at all these figures. So there's some good ones. You can look up their stories, a lot of interesting stories with these ones. So the rest of these figures are angels, and then we have the apostles up here. So this one is when we get to something a little bit more towards what people would do in the Renaissance. And the artist is Giotto, and he did the paintings, but some people believe he may have been the architect for the building too. So that's pretty common for a lot of these people. They can, especially in this late Gothic in Italy, artists start to get a lot more prominence, so they're able to do more things than just be craftspeople. And certainly Giotto was thought to be an artist in the more modern sense at that time of being an artist. And this chapel is called the Arena Chapel. So if you go to Italy, that's how they'll identify it. But our historians usually call it the Scriveni Chapel. And Scriveni was the patron, the person who paid for these paintings. And paying for these paintings was no small order. They used lapis lazuli for this blue paint. And as you can see, it's the primary paint. And if you don't know, lapis is a semi-precious stone. And to make this paint, they would grind it into a powder and then mix it with something. So just this blue paint would have been nearly as expensive as making the entire building. So what this should tell you is that Scriveni was willing to spare no expense. And part of the reason why he was willing to spare no expense is because his father had been accused of what was thought to be, which was officially a great crime at that time, and it was the crime of usury. And it's something that if it were still considered a crime today, capitalism would fall immediately. So if you're not familiar with what the term is, usury is loaning money at interest. And in the Old Testament, the Bible, it says that people cannot lend money at interest. It's unfair, uh, which it should be. They basically saw it as cheating. Could you imagine if you couldn't do that anymore? I'm sure the world would be a much better place. But again, capitalism kind of runs on debt and people making money for nothing. So um, he was accused of this crime because people still took it seriously that you shouldn't lend money at interest. But I'd already talked about how a lot of these Italian states were trading powers, and trading requires investments in boats, and travelers, and places to be able to process all the goods that are coming in. And usually people aren't going to give money even at this time without interest. So it was an open secret that people lent money at interest to make the economy go at this time. But sometimes your political enemies, if they didn't like you, they would gather up evidence that you had been doing this and then accuse you of it so they could eliminate you. And sometimes the accusers would be guilty themselves because they basically want to take over your business. So Scriveni's father had many people accuse him, probably made some enemies. And as a result, Scriveni had this big sin that he had to make up for. And sins at that time weren't just something that you had to deal with God. People could use those sins against you in business. So he used the money he had to kind of like make up for this sin. And what we're going to see is like what people usually do when they're accused of something is sometimes they'll admit it, but usually powerful people never do. Just never, even after all the evidence says so. You can look at the modern world and see that. So Scriveni didn't do that. Probably didn't even think of it for a moment. And then what else can you do? You can say, well, I didn't do it. But it works a little bit better if you say, I didn't do it. These other people did. Works even better if you say, I didn't do it. These other people that you already think are evil did it. So what we're going to see is some paintings that will talk about what a sin usury was. I would never do this, and it's a horrible sin. But also some anti-Semitic images that will basically accuse Jewish people of this sin. So pushing that sin away from you. And I'll explain why it was possible for him to do that at that time. And it's the particular form of anti-Semitism, which unfortunately still exists today. So the first image we're going to look at is Christ entering Jerusalem. And the easiest way to kind of think of it is to look how different it is from Duccio. Remember how we talked about with Duccio that if we can't really walk into this painting, we're kind of floating above it. With this one, Giotto, we can just walk right into it on the floor. And how you get that effect is you minimize the ground plane. So if you don't see a lot of ground, it gives you the impression that it's disappearing into the background. With this one, since we can see all the ground, it feels like we're floating above it. So it gives us a continuous space with the viewer. We also have like thicker, wider figures, and that makes them a little bit more three-dimensional. And notice too that there's a lot more differentiation in the faces than what we see in the Duccio. So there's some new things going on, but other than that, it's basically the same scene. The last thing you might notice is that the composition, in other words, the way that the elements are arranged in the picture, is more organized than this one. So like we had looked in the classical style in the Pisano sculpture, you can kind of trace a line that goes here and through here. It's broken by Jesus, and then another line here. There's lines there, but it's not nearly as simple and easy to follow. And this is like one of the most advanced qualities because we'll see that Giotto actually uses these lines to be able to give you a story through the composition. So Vasari, who was a painter himself, but wrote about a lot of Renaissance painters later. So he lived in the 16th century. So quite a while after this, he's looking back and he'd already seen the changes in the Renaissance, which the people in the Renaissance, what they were doing, they're self-aware that they were changing things. So Vasari says about Giotto He made a decisive break with the crude traditional Byzantine style and brought to life the great art of painting as we know it today, introducing a technique of drawing accurately from life, which had been neglected for more than 200 years. Sorry, I didn't know at the time, but neglected for much longer than 200 years, more like 1,200 years. But it's kind of interesting that he sees Giotto as part of that scene. And you can already see in Vasari's words that they looked at this French style and they saw it as, how does he describe it? He describes it as crude, traditional. And the Byzantine style is, just kind of like an early version of the French style in some ways. So I talked about composition, and he does something that's very advanced here, and it becomes common in the Renaissance. This is the Lamentation. And what it refers to is after Jesus was crucified, it's still on Friday. It's up there for like 3 hours and then he dies. Notice the 3, not a coincidence there. So he's up there for 3 hours and he dies, and they take him down from the cross. And the Lamentation can sometimes be thought of as at Christ's tomb or right below the cross after they take down his body. This one seems more like the body one, but I can't be certain. And we see Mary, the mother of Jesus, who is obviously very distraught with the way that she's looking at Jesus. She had just seen her son been tortured and executed. And then these 3 figures are Marys. It's a very common name in ancient Palestine, but they're the closest followers of Christ. And other than John, who is pictured here, these women were the only people that didn't abandon him when he was arrested and sentenced to be executed. All of those 12 apostles that we saw, except for John, and the other pictures, they jetted. They were afraid. So we see the Marys here, and we can see how the composition kind of focuses on Jesus. We see a lot of lines of sight leading towards Jesus. We even have a figure facing the other direction. That gives us some 3-dimensionality. Remember, I talked about that in the ancient Roman paintings. And these 2 guys behind are basically benefactors. One of these is Nicodemus, and the other one's Joseph, not his father. And they were just a couple of rich dudes that hooked Jesus up with a tomb, because normally a homeless guy wouldn't have a tomb. But you'll also notice and also the angels are kind of crying and all looking at Jesus. You also notice if you just kind of unfocus, the easiest way to see, there's like a shape that's made here. So if you start here, we have a line that leads all the way literally down to Jesus. And the rest of the figures, even John, is kind of dipping down to like emphasize it, and almost makes like a big arrow here. And what Giotto is doing here is pretty sophisticated. He's taking our eye. A lot of times people want to start at the top of the screen. At this time, people would start at the right because that's the good side, remember? So we kind of see the eye starting here and then going down here. And what this tree is it represents the original sin of humanity. So remember I talked about there's kind of a short story to Christianity. Adam and Eve commit the first sin. Through it, they bring hardship to people, but also death. You can never have salvation. You can never go to heaven. Then Jesus is God made flesh. That flesh is sacrificed, and it wipes away that original sin for all who believe in him and allows people to get salvation. So this tree is the tree of knowledge that Adam and Eve committed the first sin on. But the way it's portrayed is from a book that was being written at this time by a friend of Giotto's named Dante. It's a really cool book if you're interested in it. It's called The Divine Comedy. And in it, Dante tells a story about taking a visit to heaven, to purgatory, which is the space where Christians believe that people who don't believe in Christ go to, and hell. And so it's in 3 parts. And the most interesting, of course, is when he goes to hell. That's called Inferno, usually in English. And in the beginning of the story, we see Dante, and he's kind of narrating it as he's seeing everything. He meets like kind of like a tour guide for each of these areas. So when he goes to hell, he meets this tour guide. And he says, I can take you to the depths. And Dante's like, yeah, sure, why not? And the guy takes him to this cliff. And at the cliff, he sees the first sin, because Christians believe that people are damned to hell if they have too many sins. And when he does, Dante kind of like passes out and falls down the cliff. And when he rolls, he ends up in hell. So what Dante's kind of showing, or what Giotto is kind of showing us here, is this tree of knowledge, the first sin. It leads to the sacrifice of Jesus, and that leads to the salvation of all humanity. So he's telling this short story of Christianity, and he's using the way that he arranges the parts of the picture to tell the story. That is not something that people did before this time, not even in ancient Rome and Greece. So this is a new thing. They do it in other traditions in the world, but not here. So we can kind of compare the scene to the Death of the Virgin from Strasbourg. There isn't a composition other than everyone's eyes looking at Mary. There isn't, the story could have been told in a more interesting way, because remember, they're trying to say that Mary has an immaculate conception, but there isn't really like lines like there are here that's telling the story like what Giotto is doing. So it's more sophisticated the way he's using the composition. So this one is part of the same series of wall paintings, and they want to show the Passion of Christ. So in other words, the whole story that leads the last week of Jesus's life, especially the Last Supper, which is the last meal that he has with his closest followers, the apostles, then his betrayal, his arrest, his execution, and death. And then in the modern church, they talk about the resurrection as well. So this is part of that story. And it goes through the week. So we had already seen on Sunday, that's called Palm Sunday. All the people at Jerusalem were like, wow, Jesus is so cool. He's awesome. But by the end of the week, people are starting to believe, some of the leadership, the religious leadership at that time, that Jesus is horrible. And it's probably because Jesus was fond of criticizing the leadership at that time in ways that were very smart. That didn't seem like they were criticizing, but they knew what he was doing, so he criticized their hypocrisy. He had gone to the temple earlier in the week, and he had noticed that there were people who were having commerce inside of the temple. And he saw it, and he said, there shouldn't be business in God's house. So Jesus definitely not a capitalist. So he destroys all of these tables. And as you can imagine, people were pissed off about that. They were used to doing business in the temple because that's where everyone was going. So by the end of the week, people had turned on him. Leadership is starting to turn on him, and they convinced some people to turn on him. And the Sanhedrin, which is the leadership that he was particularly critical of, they go up to one of Jesus' followers named Judas, and they say, we're going to arrest your dude, and there's nothing you can really do about it. But maybe we can make it easier on you. We'll give you 30 pieces of silver. All you have to do is point them out to us. And he said, okay, I guess I have no choice. So what I'll do is, Judas is saying this, what I'll do is tell you where he's going to be. And they're like, cool. We'll send our soldiers to go arrest him. And then they say, wait, how are we going to know? They didn't know what Jesus looked like because he's just a regular looking dude. Not like this dude. So Judas says, I'll go with the soldiers, with the police, or however you want to think of them. And when I see my rabbi, I will kiss him. So that's what we see here. So what happens right before this is after the Sanhedrin kind of like hires Judas for this, Jesus gets together, and this is on a Thursday night, with his closest followers, and they have this last meal. It's famously depicted by Leonardo in his painting The Last Supper. And in that meal, he does what's called the Eucharist, and it's something that's so celebrated by Catholics every Sunday. In it, he takes some bread and he says to his followers, "This is my body," and he breaks the bread and gives it to the followers, and they eat it. Then he takes the wine for the meal and he says, "This is my blood." So later on, Christians saw that as a kind of symbol for the sacrifice of Jesus' flesh for sins. So Catholics believe that in the church, they have the priest do the exact same thing every Sunday. And the priest blesses some bread and some wine. And Christians literally believe that it transforms into the flesh and the blood of Christ. And then we eat it. That's what I did when I was a kid. I like to call Catholics diavores because they literally believe that they're eating God. So he says when he breaks the bread, he says, the next person that dips their bread, because, bread's boring without some dip, is going to be a person that betrays me. And all the apostles look at themselves like, no one would betray you. And then Judas, sure enough, dips his bread in right after Jesus. And then he goes out to meet with the soldiers. So we see him here kissing Jesus. You might already notice that there's a difference between the way that Jesus and Judas are portrayed. There's a side part of the story. After the meal, Jesus goes to hang out with 3 of his closest followers. Peter is one of them. And because Christians believe Jesus is God, Jesus knows he's going to be tortured and executed the next day. And because, again, they believe he's a human, but God at the same time, he has human feelings. So he doesn't want to be tortured. He's freaking out. And he asks Peter and the other dudes to stay up with him and support him. And they don't. They fall asleep. And Jesus has so much stress over it that he literally cries blood. So when the soldiers, when they hear him coming, everybody wakes up. They try to arrest him. And all of a sudden, Peter, he's really awoke. He takes out his sword and cuts off the ear of one of the figures. Then Jesus, to kind of show that he loves everybody, even the people that are coming to arrest him, picks up the ear and puts it back on the guy, and he's healed. So it's one of the kind of miracles of Jesus. So I have to show you in close up because, if you get violence in a picture, you gotta do it. So it must have been a pretty clean cut because this guy didn't even notice his ear was getting cut off. This always makes me think of Reservoir Dogs for some reason. If you get in kind of close, you can pause this and look at the differences that you see between Jesus and Judas. Okay, if you start it up again, the first thing is that Jesus, you may notice, probably doesn't look like too many Palestinians you've seen in your life. People are fond in Europe of making Jesus look European. So he has a very straight nose. He has hair that's like a little bit curly, but not so curly. He's very pale. And he has qualities where you look at him and you'd be like, this could be a French dude or a British dude or something like that. And there's already a certain amount of white supremacy building in Europe at this time. Whereas if you look at Judas, he's portrayed in a totally different way. He has a brow that hangs out heavily over his eyes and makes a big shadow. His nose is bigger and makes a hook. His jaws come out really far and his jowl kind of puffs out. And his hair is really frizzy. The last thing is he's wearing yellow. So all of these elements would tell the people in the picture that at the time that people are looking at this picture, that Judas is Jewish. So you might think, wait, why don't they portray Jesus that way? Jesus is Jewish as well. But it's part of this interesting and anti-Semitic kind of narrative that grew up around this time and continued into the 20th century. A lot of there's modern Christians that still have these anti-Semitic views, and it can be summarized as the Jews killed Jesus. So part of that is the idea that Jesus, even though he's Jewish himself, so they don't have problems with the contradiction here, had criticized the Jewish leadership, and they were ones that had him arrested and such. So instead of thinking of Jesus as a Jewish person who's criticizing his own leadership, they kind of took that story and said, it's the Jews. And so this kind of anti-Semitic imagery was already becoming common at this time and would continue. Most of your favorite artists in the West would make imagery in this way until the 19th century. And then it would be reused later on by the Nazis, and we'll see some very good examples that are similar to what the Nazis used. So remember when I talked about Scriveni, and he was accused of usury. So why did he want to use anti-Semitism to say, oh, they're the ones doing it? Jewish people at this time did live in Europe, and they generally lived in places, especially in Italy and Germany, which were separated from everybody else. And in Germany specifically, a lot of German princes said, hey, we're going to make a part of town that you can be safe in, because they had already felt unsafe around Christians. And then part of the reason why is because against all odds, Jewish people in Europe were able to keep their traditions. And that made them an other. Since they were also a minority, it made them easy scapegoats for whatever, especially powerful people wanted to blame people on, especially so that powerful person would get blamed for stuff themselves. So one of the things that we see with anti-Semitism is this idea that the Jews are money hungry, and they're able to base that on one bit of reality that didn't apply to most Jewish people at this time and still doesn't. In the Old Testament of the Bible, it says that usury is against the rules. And remember, this part is the Jewish Bible. But in the Jewish Bible, it says it's not wrong. It's kind of complicated, but it says it's not wrong to lend to Gentiles, meaning non-Jewish people, at interest. You're supposed to do it fairly and forgive the debts every 7 years, but that's the idea. So Jewish people in Europe, because of anti-Semitism, they were prevented from doing almost anything that could make you any money at all. So they couldn't be like carpenters or stone carvers. They couldn't own a lot of businesses because it was literally against the law in a lot of these places. So people that did manage to make it, like, people are farmers and do simple jobs just for the Jewish community. But a few people figured out that you could be money lenders because it was, and it would be pawn shops at this time. So pawn shop is a type of money lending. And they figured out that was something that people needed, and Christians believed that they weren't allowed to do it. So then it became this association with the money-grubbing Jewish people. And because some of those very few, this isn't all Jewish people, most Jewish people didn't do jobs like this, became important in banking later on, it became part of this like kind of conspiracy that Jewish people control the world, and something that people like Hitler had used later on. So this type of anti-Semitism is very early, both the way the imagery is used and with the ideas. And it really comes from how you see stuff like this usually happen. Powerful people want to justify their actions, so they blame another. Depending on what year you're listening to this, like, you may think of a president that does exactly that. So a couple of other things that go into some of these interesting narratives about Judas. And I was just reading today as people were commenting about how it's strange that Christians don't like Judas, because without him doing what he did, then Jesus wouldn't have been able to have been killed, and he wouldn't have been able to make the sacrifice. So literally the salvation of Christ wouldn't work. So he's kind of an important figure. And if you read the gospel, you're not going to get this stuff out of it. He just seems like kind of like a sad figure. After Jesus is arrested, he feels guilty and ends up hanging himself. But what we see, again, so Scriveni's father accused of usury, and Dante, who's also pretty anti-Semitic, he has a lot of like kind of interesting imagery where he shows this idea of a demon that's kind of controlling Judas. And in this one, he's meeting with the Sanhedrin, who are the Jewish leadership. There's like two different parts at this time, but Jesus was not a fan of the Sanhedrin, and he's the ones that he criticized a lot. But you'll notice that the way they're portrayed is just like Jewish stereotypes that would be known to everyone at that time, but were also used later on. So we already saw the ones with Judas, which is very clear here. But there's also the like kind of money grubbing Jew where they have like they're kind of bent over, stringy hair, a long beard, dark circles on their eyes. The Nazis used, and you can look up Nazi anti-Semitic propaganda and find images of people portrayed in exactly this way, and other ones that are portrayed exactly like Judas. So this is a very common way of expressing anti-Semitism at this time, and as part of that Jews killed Jesus type of narrative. But just in case, he wants to make sure everybody knows that this is a particularly bad sin. Dante had like an interesting idea, which other people probably had as well, that people who committed sins when they were damned to hell, they'd be tortured in eternity according to their sins. So one of the ways is the usurers, they'd be tortured by being hanged by their money belts. So that's what we're seeing here. Again, yes, the screen, this is very creepy. Remember, they're trying to convince you not to do these things. So some of the stories aren't necessarily propaganda that Scriveni wanted. And when I say propaganda, I mean an idea that you want to convince people of through imagery. With this one, there were other people. So at this time, there was kind of a fight between two different monastic orders, the Franciscans and the Dominicans. And the Franciscans were quite fond of this idea of the cult of Mary, of making Mary someone special, of the Immaculate Conception, that sort of thing. So they used their influence to get the type of imagery that shows Mary as being special. So in this one, we're seeing something that isn't in the Bible. A lot of these stories come from the Golden Legend. So the Bible, especially the Gospels, for Christians is kind of frustrating because there's a lot of pieces of the story that are left out. And so this Golden Legend, it has a lot of stories that you might recognize, like knights and dragons and such, but also kind of fills in the blanks for some of the biblical stories. And in some ways, like supports this cult of Mary. So in this one, we're seeing the meeting of Joachim and Anna. I never pronounce that very well. And that's the parents of Mary. And in it, we can see that they're kind of portraying that even Mary's parents are saintly because they have this halo. So it's showing this kind of idea that Mary is something special. One other detail I want to notice in this is, again, Giotto's fond of these three-dimensional tricks. Notice the feet facing towards us. We had seen that in ancient Rome. It's a way for artists to show off. But Giotto's style is done by Giotto, and he's very famous and well-respected at the time, probably the most well-respected artist. He's certainly getting most commissions. But in Italy, we see that style, the French style, become popular. And so they kind of mix the French style with the Byzantine style, and it goes back to what it was. So Simone Martini, who is a student of Giotto, isn't doing quite what Giotto is doing. He's doing more like what we saw from Duccio earlier. So I talked about the Avignon popes in the early 14th century. There's a split in the popes, and some of them go to France. And then when they reunite and they just have one pope in Rome, that French style comes back with them, so it becomes very popular in Italy. So we see the story as a part of the Passion of the Christ when he's being executed, and he has to carry his cross. They really like to torture you well, the ancient Romans, right? So we get in close, we can see some elements that are from Giotto. So there's an attempt at three-dimensionality. You can see how we have the foreshortening in the foot. Everybody's standing very solidly on the ground. But when we get far away, we don't have that minimized ground plane that feels like we can walk in the picture like we did with Giotto. Instead, we're floating above like we saw with Duccio. But when we actually get in close, it looks like everyone's standing on the ground. And then the faces are kind of Gothic in that there's not quite as much differentiation like we had seen in Giotto. And we have very kind of elegant style Gothic faces and lots of gold, which is more Gothic. And instead of having those blue skies like we saw in Giotto that bring us into the natural world, we have a gold background, just like we saw in Duccio. So I'm quite fond of this style. And I think Martini is probably one of the best. And this is one of the more kind of beautiful, radiant, even examples of it. And that's the Annunciation. The gold on here has been recently restored, which is a maddeningly difficult thing to do, because this gold is like leaf. It's like aluminum foil, basically, but made out of gold. But once it was cleaned, it's just amazing. You can't even like photograph how beautiful it looks. And in the Annunciation, we're seeing full-on Martinis doing the French style, the elegant style. We can see that with the long neck and the kind of graceful long fingers on the angel Gabriel. And then we see Mary. She's got that alien face, like the Virgin in Paris. I always say it just reminds me of the gray aliens that you see in movies sometimes. And she's doing that same stance here where she's pulling back, even though she's seated this time. And we can see Gabriel's actually literally saying words, which I'm going to read in a moment, and I'll tell you what it means. It's pressed into the gold. But Mary's also holding a book. And you'll often see that because it's the association of Christians have with the scripture, but also something a little bit more specific. In one of the Gospels, which is kind of like the most poetic of them, the Gospel of John, it begins with this really interesting concept that comes from Greek. The Gospels were originally written in Greek because that was the language that most people spoke in educated people spoke in ancient Palestine. Everyday people spoke Aramaic, but if you wanted to speak to foreigners, you would speak in Greek. It's called a lingua franca. It means the language that everybody speaks. Modern day lingua franca is English. You can go most places in the world and use that. At this time in Palestine, it was Greek. So everyone's writing in Greek. So it's a very Greek concept. He starts out where, when you see it translated in English, it says, in the beginning, there was a word, and the word was God. And then he goes on and he says, and the word was made flesh. So it's important to kind of understand what the word means. The word in Greek that was used is logos, which literally means word. But what it meant at this time was this concept that words are creative power. So the way you could translate, instead of saying the word, would be saying, in the beginning, there was the creative power of God. And the creative power of God was good. And the creative power of God was made flesh. So that's why she carries the book within her. She's making the creative power of God into flesh. When we get in close, we can see that he's saying Ave Maria. He's saying, hail to you, the holiest of all women. Next to it are some lilies, and there's many flowers that are used or associated with Mary at this time, like roses and such. But the lilies were used, and nowadays people use it, and even they associate so-called purity with lilies. And you got to kind of remember, there's a very patriarchal vision of what virginity means at this time, because basically men and patriarchy look at women's bodies as something that men own. So the idea of being a so-called virgin, of never having sex, is purity, because a woman is supposed to not ever have sex until she gets married, until her owner, her husband, is able to like free her from that. So it's an unfortunate like association, virginity with purity, but that's what they meant at the time. And then very long neck and kind of small face. We see like, both feminine and masculine genders in this one. Very common for this elegant style. And these long fingers, called a Gothic gesture, in that it's kind of like graceful and easy, and also kind of practiced. It's not something most people would do. And the same thing with Mary. You can really see that kind of gray alien face. So it says, "Hail Mary, full of grace, God is with you." And he really means that literally, like inside of you. And with the book, again, we have the beginning of John, the Logos, the creative power of God made flesh. So in the rest of the 14th century, a lot of artists are working, doing things like what Giotto did, doing things they saw in ancient Rome. People are going all around and getting kind of close to what would eventually happen in the Renaissance. So Pietro Lorenzetti has this picture, again, another of these ones that try to talk about Mary being special. It's called The Birth of the Virgin. And we see Mary's mom, she's already got that halo. And then look at Mary, little baby Mary, portrayed exactly as Jesus would be at the time. She already has this halo. So definitely, and then the father, Joachim, definitely going for this whole Immaculate Conception. We also see a bunch of things, some of which are Gothic, so this pointed arch, but the way that it's portrayed, where it looks three-dimensional, like we can get underneath it, is very illusionistic. We even see attempts at what's called, what we saw a little bit of in ancient Rome, what's called linear perspective, where if you want to make something look 3D, you have the lines all converge towards a point in the background. They didn't do quite right because they didn't understand the math, but it does give this three-dimensional effect. We're a little bit high up the floor, but we still feel like kind of like Giotto, like we could walk into the painting. And like ancient Rome, it seems like not only could you walk into the painting, but you could walk out the door and go into the background. So even though there's Gothic architecture being portrayed and a lot of Gothic type of faces, there's also a lot of classicism, like ancient Rome, trying to make things look illusionistic. So this kind of pictorial illusionism, meaning trying to fake reality like you can actually, like it's real, characterized ancient Roman mural painting that hadn't been practiced in Italy for nearly 1,000 years, but we're seeing it right here, just like ancient Pompeii. There is an attempt at perspective. It's not quite right. It wasn't until the 15th century that artists figured out the math behind it. If you're in my Renaissance to modern class, we'll learn about that later. If you're in 121, I guess you'll have to take another class to find out. So what I'm talking about here is most relevant if you're in 122, but also very interesting if you're in 121. And I'm showing another Lorenzetti. So the Lorenzetti family, they were all painters. And then Martini here. And something that happened that, if you're listening to this in 2020, is, I think you might relate to. And that was a worldwide pandemic called the Black Death. And it lasted from 1347 to about 1351. And no one's sure where it started, but it affected people from China all the way to England. So all the way across Eurasia. And it's thought in only 4 years that somewhere around the third of the population of Europe and Asia died. So unimaginable horror. We know now that the Black Death is the bubonic plague. At that time, there's been genetic evidence to show that. That's recently, just in case you're wondering. But at the time, they didn't really know anything about it. And they weren't able to stop it because people hadn't been exposed to it probably for a long time, if anything. In big cities, because the disease is carried on fleas that are on rats, people are more likely to be infected and they were more likely to die. So in some big cities, including really packed ones like in France and especially in Italy that are densely populated, we're talking 80, 90% of the people dying in a city in 4 years. And I'm sure most of you are thinking that is unimaginable, but that's what they went through. Some of the artists we looked at, both of the Lorenzetti brothers and Simone Martini died. And that was the case with tons of artists, with tons of leadership. And it's probably not a coincidence that you see the Renaissance kind of starting 50 years after this, because a lot of old leadership is dying, a lot of things fall apart, a lot of traditions like literally die with bodies. So people are starting new things. Um, Leaders are scrambling to try to, consolidate power. So it's not unusual that a lot of big changes happen in Europe and in Asia in the end of the 14th and the beginning of the 15th century. And a lot of people look at this period as kind of the beginning of the modern era. In other words, the kind of beginning of Europe and Europeans as this dominant and eventually imperialist, even genocidal force throughout the world that still continues today in the United States is kind of the hopefully last gasp of that particular type of dominance. Hopefully it won't be replaced by anyone else dominating. So this is the Black Death probably has some relationship with that, the big changes that happen. And people at the time started to question everything. Some people became more religious. They said this is a plague from God because we're not giving enough sins. Other people said no, they wanted to go back to the old religions that people hadn't forgot about, like animistic religions and witchcrafts and things like that. And other people just said, maybe not so much religion. Maybe we'll study more humanistic things. So a lot of changes happen. So if you're in Art 121, this is the last one. If you're in Art 122, this is just the first of many, but most of them won't be this long. So thank you very much.